Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Arts Equal and the University of the Arts Helsinki, I wish you all welcome to this Studia Generalia lecture. In his lecture today, Professor Gert Biesta asks, what does it mean to try to be at home in the world from the perspective of arts and education beyond learning? Biesta is Professor of Public Education at the Centre for Public Education and Pedagogy of Maynooth University, Ireland, and Professor for Education at the University of Humanistic Studies in the Netherlands. Among his wide list of publications, the most recent books include The Rediscovery of Teaching and Letting Art Teach. Professor Biesta is a progressive thinker within educational philosophy. His work focuses on the theory of education with a specific interest in questions of democracy and democratization, as well as how to give teaching back to education in the age of learning or learnification. Professor Biesta draws from philosophers who are familiar to many of us in Arts Equal, at least, such as John Dewey, Hannah Arendt, and Jacques Rancière. We are very honored to have him here with us today, so please join me in welcoming Professor Gert Biesta.
Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for being here and traveling through the snow or staying on and having more snow when you travel back home. We have about an hour, and I always prepare too much, so I'll try to make a start in talking about some of the ideas in the title, and what I want to do is to gain or develop a kind of educational perspective on this, and that's mostly what I want to talk about. I'll do that also with reference to two of the books you mentioned, including the book, a little book on art education that some of you may know or may not know. So you may some ideas that you think, oh, I've heard that before, but I think that's never bad. Someone recently wrote a very detailed and attentive review of this book, Letting Art Teach. And I would say she had it completely wrong. And I like that because I think as human beings we should have the freedom of our own interpretation. But nonetheless, it's interesting to stay in conversation and say, well, look again from this angle, or this is how I see it. So that's what I'll be trying to do. I'll use quite a lot of PowerPoint just to keep myself organized and on track. If you want to read that later, I can always distribute it. And I also hope we have some time for conversation, question, discussions. There's only one idea in the talk, but I'll look at that idea from a number of different angles. And it has a lot to do with the question, what actually is an educational perspective on all these issues. And to get you into the mood of that conversation, I have a couple of questions for you to start with. Here is an interesting one. Why do parents speak to their newborn child? You can think of your own answer and then you can check later, because I'll come back to this question. This is one. This is another one that actually is quite important for people in education. The question, does education actually matter? Does it make a difference? And that discussion is often picked up in the bigger question of nature, nurture, and then maybe something for education. And the question is, how much does education contribute given that we have all kind of natural and biological and physiological and genetic science, that we have society, culture with all kind of influences. So is there still room for education to do something? Now maybe if you believe in equality, you would say let's give 1/3 to each, nature, nurture, education. But what you see over time is that people pushing this in different directions. And there is literature that says actually it's for a very large percentage nature, genetic influences, ways in which brains are hardwired. Then there's a bit of social environment, so you see that the scope for education getting smaller and smaller. So the second question for you is, what percentage would you put in each of these boxes? Nature, nurture, education. Third question. Does anyone know who this is? Maybe you know. I don't know whether this helps. This is Rosa Parks, the woman who in 1955 sat in a bus in Montgomery, and there was a clear sign in the bus, white in the front, colored at the back. And you could say what was wrong with Rosa Parks. Was she unable to decode a very clear message? So some people say education is all about learning and becoming literate, and then you could say, well, has something gone wrong in her education? This guy, well known, it looks like he is happily listening to some music. Well, actually, this is what he looked like a while before. This is Adolf Eichmann. And again, you can ask questions about his education. You can ask the question, did he learn to listen too well? Because when Adolf Eichmann was put in a court proceeding in Israel, he said his only defense for all the actions he was responsible for was saying, well, I just followed orders. I did what was being taught. So I'm giving a couple of these examples in order to make the point about education. And the point is made in a very interesting and, in a sense, remarkable way by a German scholar, Dietrich Benner, who in a book on education has a whole section on this question, how much is nature, how much is nurture, social environment, and how much is the influence of education. And then he comes with a remarkable claim where he says, nature and nurture is together always 100%. And we can differ about how much is nature and how much is nurture. But he says, together it always adds up to 100%. Now you could say that's strange for a professor in education to give education away, because it looks like an argument for saying education doesn't matter. But then he does something interesting, because he says education matters in a different way. Education, he says, is not about the question what kind of influences make us how we become who we are. It's not about the question how we can influence that, but he says education is interested in something else. It's concerned with the question, as I put it here, how out of these developments an I can step forward. So he is saying education is not part of the total percentage that we have to distribute. Education, in a sense, cuts across that. It's of a different order. He calls this educational act, in German Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit. And it's such a nice expression in German that it's difficult to translate. You can say it's a summoning, people often say. I call it here an injunction. Later I'll talk about an invitation. To Selbsttätigkeit in German means self-action, but it's not sort of a summoning to be yourself, just be who you are, but it's the injunction to be a self. So Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit is sort of to say, be a self, be an I. And that's interesting about Rosa Parks, who in that situation where she was perfectly able to read what was on the sign and what she was supposed to do, stepped up as an I and said, I no longer want to be part of the way in which society is being ordered for me. On the other hand, you can say what Adolf Eichmann did when people asked, where are you? He said, I am not here. So there is no I you can say there. So the simple work of education, you can say, is to knock on the door of another human being and to say, is there someone there? And then there are two possible answers. We say, yeah, I'm here, or we keep quiet, or we say, I'm sort of here, or not entirely here, so there's a whole shade of things. This, for me, is what educators for a long time have been interested in, but I think this interest has moved to the margins, because with the rise of all kind of interesting insights, developments in research, it looks like people were saying this is an old question that we no longer need, because we can now put people in scanners and we don't see the eye there, but we can see the brain, for example, or we can do all kind of complicated studies to see what kind of factors influence how people become. So some people might say, this is old stuff and we have something better now. What I'm trying to argue here is that a lot of that research asks a different question. And this educational question, this question of the I, is actually not an old question, but you can say it's still a very urgent question, but not a popular. I would characterize this educational question as an existential question. So this is not the question of who we are or how we become who we are, which I would say is a question of identity. And identity has become another popular concept. I would even say it has become almost an obsession of modern societies, that everyone is concerned about identity, about their individual identity. A lot of young people struggle, sometimes referred to as mental health problems, because this question of identity has become such a big question for them. It has also become a big industry, because there are a lot of people who say, if you give us some money, you can be who you want. So the question of identity also works in that economic field. And of course, it is a big political question, where there are tensions in the world, tensions within societies, in between societies, where people try to say, your identity is not our identity, so either there is no place for you, or ultimately people will go to war if they believe that it's possible to maintain a pure identity. So there is a lot happening around identity, and it's a relevant question, but the question of identity is not the educational question of the I, where I would say that is not the question who we are, but it's the question how we are. So, to look at my examples, both Rosa Parks and Adolf Eichmann had an identity. But when you ask, was there an I behind, underneath, above, around their identity, you end up with very different answers. I work a lot in English-speaking contexts, Britain and now Ireland, but I'm originally from the Netherlands. And sometimes I get stuck in the English language because I know that there are beautiful words in other languages and it doesn't really translate into English. So there is a Germanic word, subjectiviteit, which in German and Dutch works well, but not entirely in English, so I use this odd construction, subjectness, to say that is the existential question of how we are. And this, I want to suggest, is where educators are interested. So this is my first simple message, loud and clear, that the educational question is the question of the I. Now you can ask, what does it mean if you bring that question to schools, to other educational settings, and when you connect that to the arts in the broad sense? And maybe we can have some discussion about, can we even talk about the arts in general, or do we need to distinguish between different arts disciplines or even smaller units? I don't know, but I guess you'll have an opinion about it. To say something about this question, I want to look at the argument in this little book, Letting Arts Teach, in order to highlight that in the book I tried to make this educational point. And I'm doing that because I have seen readings of the book where I think people miss that point. So let's see if I can manage. I do all kinds of things in the book because I enjoy playing with readers just as I enjoy playing with students, and I mean that in the most serious sense possible. But I construct the argument around what I call a double disappearance in the field of art education, where I have concerns about where is art actually, but also where is education. And you will probably recognize or are familiar with these discussions. This one I think you're definitely familiar with. The whole question about why art. And what I see a lot in different countries, and it's interesting that emerges roughly at the same time in different countries. Quite a lot of people say, yes, we need the arts in education because the arts are useful. And as soon as you begin to talk about use, there's always the question, useful for what? And I see people nodding, so they recognize the list. They say, well, art is useful because it drives up test scores in these really important areas, language, mathematics, science. Or we need the arts because it promotes creativity or moral attitude, pro-social attitude, empathy, 21st century skills. So anything where people say this is important in education, you see arguments emerging for saying this is why arts are useful. So you could say that's good news for the arts, but one concern I have here, that if you say we need the arts because it's useful for something else, is if you find cheaper or quicker ways to promote all these things, then you can get rid of the arts again. So it's actually a very weak argument to say, oh, we need the arts because they do this, because if you can find a pill or brain stimulation to do it quicker, then the arts are out of the window again. Also, this still relies and in a sense reproduces particular hierarchies, because it actually says what art is useful for is really important, and art is sort of lower on the scale. And I really love this one that a friend of mine put on Twitter when there was another study that says the arts make you better at mathematics, and he just said, where's the research that shows that mathematics makes you better at art? And that research, I haven't come across it, maybe others have, but it shows sort of the direction of thinking. Now, of course, you can get upset about it, so the question is, where do you find a way to intervene in these discussions? And I understand that this is quite a challenge also for the Art Equal project. How do you get out of this conversation that looks like an argument for the arts, but actually gets you somewhere where you don't want to go? So if instrumental justifications are the problem, it looks like the only alternative you have is a non-instrumental justification, art for art's sake, or just say openly, art is totally useless. Now I like this as a rhetorical strategy, because at least it opens up a discussion. But there is something in the background here, which I think is, at least from an educational perspective, helpful. Because this question whether art is useful in education, I would see as what philosophers call a category mistake. It brings together a number of ways of thinking that actually have nothing to do with each other. Because as soon as you begin to ask, what is this useful for, you are in a way of thinking that you can call productive thinking. So you ask the question, what will art produce? And this is a way of thinking that has become very popular in education. So there's a whole productive way of talking that talks about when is education good, what's high quality education, well, when we have achievement, learning outcomes. The idea of outcomes is this machine where you put something in on one side and then the learning outcomes drop out at the other end. A whole obsession with measurable test results. So productive thinking has become really central in education. But as soon as you see that production is always about producing things, you can say this doesn't fit education, because an educated person is not a thing that has been produced. You can say an educated person is a human being, I call it here, with an altered outlook. Someone who, as a result of engagement with education, is positioned differently in the world. So to talk about education in terms of usefulness is actually a way that doesn't fit education. It's the wrong category, you could say. That's why philosophers call it a category mistake. In everyday language, it's about comparing apples and pears, or cats and dogs. So here you can begin to try to change the discourse by saying, what is an appropriate way to talk about education? And then you can say, education is never about what it produces, but about what it means. What does it mean for students to have had education? That is an appropriate question. Or if you want to get closer to the language, this is a nice thing you can do in English. You can say, the question of education is not what education makes, but what it makes possible. So it's never a question of production, but what we constantly do in education is we create opportunities for students to step into, to exist. In the other book, you mentioned the rediscovery of teaching. I say, what is teaching? Teaching is not telling people what to believe. Teaching is creating existential possibilities, ways of existing, where students can step into, and they then have to figure out what happens when they make that step. Existential ways of being, you can say different ways of being, different ways of existing differently. Here I already think of how existing in the arts allows you to exist very differently. So that's opening up existential possibilities. Now the word I haven't used so far is the word learning, because I think it's actually a boring and uninteresting word, which I think if we could abolish one word in education, or at least say, let's for 10 years not use the word, then learning would be my candidate. Because it looks like, again, people say, well, education is all about learning. I would say, yes, learning has a place, but learning is only one existential possibility. It's one way in which we can exist as human beings, but there are so many other ways to exist as human beings. Loving, caring, concerning, being irritated, being challenged. Very different ways also to encounter this world outside of us. So if we reduce all that to learning, it just becomes very narrow. So this is the whole discussion about do we need the arts in terms of usefulness, I would say. This is a way to begin to bend that discussion and say there's actually a different question we should ask about the arts in education. But I'm not just concerned about how the arts, although they look central, are actually disappearing. As an educator, I also have concerns about what's happening to education. And by now, when I use this word, you may remember that education is about the eye. So the question is, what's happening to the eye? The positive story is to say education is really under pressure. In all countries, students are being pressured and teachers are being pressured to focus on this small set of learning outcomes, and there is a whole global industry that tries to measure that. And at some point, it's just terrible for students and terrible for teachers. So you can say students begin to disappear more and more as subjects, and they become objects. And what you see here is that people slowly are beginning to see if that is how we organize our schools. We create something that is so out of balance that you can wonder, are we doing the right thing? And here again, many people are turning towards the arts to say the arts can happen to rebalance education, to make it more humane. And these are some of the arguments where people say when we bring the arts in, we create opportunities, existential possibilities, you could say, for children or students to express their voice, to make their own sense rather than just to repeat what mathematics tests say, to be creative rather than productive, to generate their own meaning rather than to be told what they should think, and to articulate their own unique identity rather than just sit in rows and perform. So here you can see another important development, an interesting argument for saying here the arts have something to contribute, to rebalance education, to bring in a more humane dimension. But as educator, I have a question, and the question is phrased here as, what if? And this is quite a handy question. So if you want to look at a situation or a proposal or curriculum from an educational perspective, the what if question can help. This is the what if part. You can say it's important that students can express their voice, but what if the voice that is coming out is racist? It's important that creativity has a place, but creativity is a force that can go in any direction. So what if creativity is destructive? Children, students, young people should have room to express their identity, but again the question is, what if that identity is only interested in itself? And here the educational question, you can say, comes in again. The work that educators do is on the one hand to open up opportunities for expression. So this is a really important first step. But education does something more difficult than just to say everything should emerge, everyone should have a voice, everyone should be allowed to express. Education, you can say, brings in the question whether what arrives, what emerges from children, students, young people, whether that is going to help or hinder in relation to the whole question of what I call the existing subject. You can say whether it's going to help or hinder in this challenge of being an I. And that is the educational question that needs to be asked in relation to arguments that say, let's bring in the arts because that allows for expression, because expression in itself is neutral, it can be good or bad. You can say to bring in that question, not just as a question that comes from us as educators, but actually to make students enthusiastic for that question. That is Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit. That is this process in which we constantly as educators go back and say, is there someone within this expression, this identity, this creativity? Now, Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit sounds very German and very serious. I've tried to come up with a different way to describe it in English, and I think English is a softer language, but maybe even a softer culture. So I would say what we are after here as educators is to arouse a desire in our students for wanting to exist in the world, not just with themselves, in a grown-up way. That is, in a sense, the gesture we are making to say, look, there is a world out there where it's not just you, but where you meet other people and the world itself, and to arouse a desire to make that step into the world. That way of looking at education is not focused on how can we get the curriculum into the child, but it's also not just about how can we let the child express, but it actually has its focus on the world and says it's in the world that we need to figure out what it means to exist as an I. How are you doing so far? Are you tired or concentrating? Yeah? Good. Yeah, we'll manage with the time. I want to use 2 pages to say a few things about 2 aspects of this arousing the desire for wanting to exist in the world in a growing way. So I want to look briefly at what does it actually mean to exist in the world, and I want to say a few things about grown-upness, which is another word that in English doesn't really work, but sometimes words that don't work, at least, well, they help with paying attention. One thing that is quite central in this question of what does it mean to exist in the world is that the world is not a construction or not a fantasy, but the world exists independent from us. Other human beings exist independent from us, but also the world in its materiality is not an ideal. Resistance, social resistance, when I say I want something and someone else says, no, I don't want it. But also the resistance of material, or, well, I'm a musician, I play the oboe, and if there is one instrument that really offers an awful lot of resistance, it is the oboe. There we meet reality, we could say. So we meet reality in the encounter with resistance. When we meet resistance, you can sort of theoretically think of 3 responses. And it's a little theory, but I find it helpful. Resistance creates a moment of frustration because you want something and then you meet a reality that says, no, that's not entirely possible. So one thing you can do is to say, but I really want this, and you begin to push. Now this is important to make things happen, but when you push too hard, you will reach a point where you destroy the very reality you meet. So if you put a big word on that, you can say, there is always a risk that in response to meeting resistance, we destroy the world. But when we meet resistance and get frustrated, it's also possible that we move back, that we shy away, that we say, this is far too difficult for me, I can't take this on. And when that goes to the extreme, we can say we take ourselves away from the world. And we can call that self-destruction. Now, when you begin to paint the picture in this way, you can say these 2 extremes are places where we are no longer in the world, because we've destroyed the world or we have destroyed ourselves. And there you can say what the encounter of resistance actually hints at is the challenge of staying in the middle ground, staying away from these 2 extremes, and try to figure out where we can be in meeting reality, other human beings, or the material world outside of us. We can call that dialogue, but no dialogue is conversation. I think there is too much conversation in education in some countries. In the Netherlands, they are always talking, and sometimes I think stop talking and pay attention. So dialogue, you can say, is an existential form. Dialogue is a challenge to stay with precisely what you are not. That is what it means to be in the world. It is to try to stay with all that offers resistance. And that's quite difficult because the extremes, in a sense, are tempting. So you can call this a worldly space, but you can also say this is exactly the place of education, because there we meet something outside of us, you can say, that wants to teach us something. And the first thing it teaches is that you are not alone in this world. Now, if I want to make a bold statement, and I'm doing it for the sake of time, because I know we can have very subtle discussions about art, but for the moment I just want to say, when I look at art in many different manifestations, I would say, this is what art is about. Art is this ongoing dialogue to meet the world and figure out what we are doing in relation to the world, to meet it in its materiality, in its ideality, if that's a word, in its temporality. So for me, art actually is at the heart of that middle ground. Grown-upness. Again, in English, a strange idea, but also an idea that has been, I would say, taken over a lot of by developmental psychology that says, well, you go through a number of developmental stages, or you work hard for 18 years and suddenly you are grown up. I don't think that that's a good way to think about grown-upness. Partly because I know people who have been around for decades and decades, and I don't think they have ever mastered what it means to exist in a grown-up way. Some even become president of the United States. On the other hand, I meet young people, very young people, where I see qualities of grown-upness that amaze me. So for me, grown-upness is this quality of how we try to be in this middle ground. Philippe Marieux, a brilliant French educational scholar, says grown-upness is about being in the world, not with yourself, but out there with all this difficult stuff that offers resistance, without thinking that you're in the center of your world. So you can say it's a decentered or eccentric way of existing. And there we constantly encounter this educational question for ourselves. Is what I want here, is that going to help me? Is that going to help us also on a vulnerable planet to live together well? Now that question is a question that interrupts. It's saying you're not in the center of the universe. There are other people there as well. There is a planet with limited capacity to fulfill all our desires. And it's in meeting that moment of interruption that in a sense we are called to be an eye. Not to go with the flow, but to stand there and come to some kind of temporary resolution. So education has this interruptive quality. It interrupts desires. It interrupts us just being interested in ourselves. It even interrupts the natural and social order. And this is the 100% argument that I said before. Education cuts through nature and society. Very strange idea. This is not about getting rid of our desires. There is old pedagogy, and in some countries I say there is old Catholic pedagogy that says desire is bad, and if you get rid of all your desires, then you are in heaven. Well, heaven is for later, but here on earth we meet desires. We meet the desire to want to live together as well as we can. So the whole question is about trying to meet our desires and to begin to figure out individually and collectively which of those desires are going to help with this challenge of being I, and which of those desires are going to hinder. And that's particularly important, but that's a whole additional discussion. I think in a world and a time where actually we are constantly being sort of pushed to desire more. This is the quick example if you want to get it. Probably there are more people in the room who have this kind of mobile phone. Apple, the company that is involved in this, doesn't sell mobile phones. What Apple sells, and that's brilliant, is the desire for a new mobile phone. And they sell us that for free, but once that desire has sort of entered us, then suddenly we are there with our money and the exchange is happening. So we live in an economy that constantly says, desire more and never ask whether that's a good idea. Again, the bold claim I put here, and I do it a bit more subtle in the book, I would say, when I look at art, I see that art does tremendous work in not just meeting the world, but meeting ourselves and our desires in relation to the world. And actually art provides all kinds of forms in which we work in that area of exploring our desires. So that brings me to 3 statements about education, and then I'm done. So the first thing I would like to highlight about the educational work in this whole center is that education, because it's interested in the eye, is interruptive work. So anyone who tries to sell you the idea that education is pleasant and that we should not ask difficult questions, we should challenge our students, they tell a lie about education. Education is this work of at least interrupting desires, not destroying desires, but asking a moment of, wait a minute, what's happening there? It's the interruption of just always being with yourself, the interruption of identity, as I said before. And we can do that in all kinds of ways by putting little things in front of our students. Little things that maybe for a moment delay or resist. We have to be careful that not any interruption is educational. So again, there is an old-fashioned moral education that just says you want something, I'm going to tell you you should not want it. Then you end up not creating space where students can begin to ask that question for themselves. So educational interruptions are always orientated to helping with existing in a grown-up way. So you can say what we try to do there as educators is we open up a space where a student or a child can step forward as an I or not. And we never know whether or how the child or student will make that step, but our work is to constantly open that very particular space. Now I would say, and this is the theme of equality, I know that the research is really interested in how to get rid of inequality. I want to suggest that there is something at the heart of education that by its very definition is equalizing. Because you can say, when we try to open up this space, what we are constantly saying is, the challenge to be an I is the same challenge for everyone. So it's not that you can become a better I if you are more competent, or have studied more, or if you have more money. Yeah, the question of the I cuts through all that. Having a lot of money may actually prevent you from being an I. Being very competent may actually block you from being an I. This you can say is poor education in the positive sense of the word. This is my answer to the question why parents speak to their newborn baby. Because what they are doing there is approaching their baby not as a thing that needs to be influenced in order to develop in a particular direction. They speak to the baby as an I. And when we speak to one, in a sense, you can say we are approaching them as subject, but it's then for them to step into that space. In the final chapter of this book, Louise Discovery of Teaching. The chapter is called Asking the Impossible. In a sense, I'm saying this is the strange thing that we do there, that we appeal to a child and we appeal to something where we never know whether it will come. So we appeal to something where we do not know whether it will become a possibility. But that you can say is the educational gesture. There's a lovely story if you are a more concrete thinker than an abstract thinker. I'm voluntarily abstract. Homer Lane, a brilliant pedagogue, you can find more about him, probably on the internet, but not a lot. He did work with young people who had criminal convictions, and he set up a residential school in the southwest of England, and he tells stories about the educational work he does there. And one story is interesting because there is a boy who at some point he destroys a vase that he knows Homer Lane really liked. And Homer Lane calls the boy to him and he says to the boy, I see that you've destroyed this beautiful vase that means a lot to me. Now, moralizing education would then say, I'm going to punish you, or it's bad, or everything, but Homer Lane does something else. He says, I've got a watch here, and this watch is also really precious to me. And then he holds the watch in front of the boy and says, would you like to destroy the watch as well? And it's such a nice example of opening up the space where the boy can then step in, but is called to be an I and take his own responsibility. So you can say that's educational work. Jacques Rancière, I also know you've been reading his work, he takes the opposite view and he says, what is this work of calling for the I? It's denying our students the satisfaction of not being an I. That's a nice thing to think about as well in educational settings. Students in higher education have become very programmed to say to their teachers, you have to tell me what I need to do in order to succeed. And in England they say, I'm paying thousands and thousands of pounds, so I have a right to succeed. And then students sort of get into a position where they say, this is not my responsibility, but they say to the teachers, it's your responsibility that I will succeed. And then Rancière says very nicely, yeah, that's a very easy position to be in, because you say, I'm not here, it's all for you. And to deny that easy position is another way to think about the interruptive work and say, well, where are you in this setup? So this, I think, is the key to education. Now, to work interruptively is difficult, and I think the art of teaching is somewhere there, but it's also something that takes time. So this is an argument for saying, if we want education to work in these domains, we need an education that slows down. And that goes against the idea that the best education is the quickest education. That's what we now often hear policymakers, even in schools. The quicker you can get through the curriculum, the better student you are. But then you have these quick students who are gone before they are in, and the other students are left. So to think of education as a process of suspension, where we make time, where we provide space, create forms for meeting the world, meeting ourselves in relation to the world, that you can say is the educational dynamic. Gajari Spivak, Indian scholar, says very nicely, what we do in education, that's why we need time, is to look at our desires and begin to rearrange and select them. And in the educational history, there are brilliant examples of educators who understand this, who create forms, who take the time in order to get to these points. A.S. Neal's Summerhill School is often depicted as an extreme child-centered school where children can just do what they want. But Neil actually is working in a very different way. He says, I have to give the children who are in this school their own time to go to this point where they realize that just to be free and have no constraints, no resistance, is actually not what it means to exist in the world. But he says, I can't decide that point for them. They have to meet it. And therefore he says, some children need an awful lot of time to meet that point. And once they are there, they flip around and work can start. This is beautiful in the world, the word school, where colleagues have reminded us of the Greek meaning of school, and it means free time. It's precisely the time we make free for these kind of processes. It's the gift we should give to the next generation. That makes education all very difficult, and then I've also argued we shouldn't leave our students there alone and say, just sort it out. There's this beautiful English word, sustenance, where you can say we also have a duty to help our students to stay in that middle ground, to sustain them there, to nourish them there. Also because often we meet problems in the short term, and we know that in the longer term things may look very differently, but that's not what our students can see at that point in time. Again, I would say this is where the arts have meaning. Not that they are useful, but they open up a meaningful educational space. So when you ask me, how do we do interruption, how do we do suspension, how do we create sustenance, I would say that is where art can be meaningful, the existential possibilities they open. And again, these possibilities, because they are focused on constantly, in a sense, trying to get the eye into the world, these possibilities are equalizing, because the challenge of being I, as I said before, is not a challenge that is differently distributed, but it's a challenge that is there for all of us, and it breaks through all kind of other dynamics. Finally, is that a matter of understanding? This is just an afterthought, but I'm obsessed about that idea as well. There is a huge emphasis in education, but I think also in arts, on understanding and sense-making. Yeah. A lot of modern pedagogy says we need to give students the opportunity to come up with their own understandings and their own sense-making. What I really like is a definition of understanding I found in the work of Hannah Arendt, where she does this, where she said, what is understanding actually? It's an unending activity by which, in constant change and variation, we come to terms with and reconcile ourselves to reality, that is, try to be at home in the world. I find this a beautiful sentence because what this sentence describes is precisely this middle ground between world destruction and self-destruction, where we try to be at home in the world. You can say, and the world is precisely not our home. And she says, that is actually understanding. So it's not cognitive sense-making, it's something existential. Now, on the one hand, I think art can do a lot in sense-making. Education can also work in the arts in making sense of art, and I see a lot of programs with good intentions doing that. But I think Arendt points at something else. That sometimes art doesn't make sense, and that sometimes life doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean that we can walk away from it. That precisely when life doesn't make sense, illness, death, frustration. There is this challenge to try to stay with it, to try to be at home in the world. And what we encounter there, you could say, are not questions that we have. How can I make sense of this? How can we understand this? But questions that come to us. The question, what is this asking from me? What is this trying to say to me? What is this trying to teach me? You can say, the appeal there is, it's asking from us to be an I in that relationship. And again, this is a question that doesn't differentiate. It's this equalizing question that asks for each of us in those situations to be an I in equal measure. Now, I have no idea what you're going to do with all this, but this is what I wanted to share with you. Not in the hope that it will be useful, but in the hope maybe that it may be meaningful, or that it puts you somewhere else, or at least interrupts you. So, I know I've used 60 minutes and don't know if there's any time left, but thanks for your attention anyway.
But I think you took care of us and helped us back to the surface once in a while. Would anybody have a comment or question right now? While you think, I have one at least. I was thinking when you very nicely offer art as kind of like an answer to many of these questions. What kind of art are you thinking about? What is this art? Where does it happen?
Yeah.
And so
on. So that's a good question, and I cannot solve all of that. So as I said, my own experiences in the field of music, which I find interesting for a number of reasons. One you can say is that with many musical instruments playing, you are in the middle of this clash of meeting a reality and having sort of your desires about, I have desires about how I want my oboe to sound, but it's awfully sort of hard work to get even close to that. And at some point you just have to say, well, with this oboe and this reed and this temperature and whatever, I will only get that close to it. So for me that's a very concrete example of where in the process of meeting the reality of an instrument, you meet your own desires and you begin to work through it. But what I think is also interesting about music is the question of time, that music needs its own time. So in music you meet sort of the temporality of a world. You can say, well, if we play Mozart 3 times as fast, we can all be home at 9, and that's great. But then you no longer have that reality. And for me this is interesting because it gets you into something, you can say, you meet an existential possibility where you are being called to stick with the temporality of that reality. So for me, those are 2 little examples of what music can do there. With a lot of visual arts, I hear people who say, I can't make sense of it. And then sort of they stop there and they say, well, it doesn't mean anything because I cannot make sense of it. To turn that around and say, but the whole point is not that I make sense of that, because then it's essentially just projecting what you want to see on it, and if you don't see what you get, then you get frustrated. But a lot of visual art, and that has become, again, an interesting experience for me. If you turn that around and say, what is this actually asking for me? So, what's the appeal to me to exist as an I in relation to something that I cannot make sense of? I find that really interesting in meeting sort of visual arts. In doing the visual arts, you meet a lot of materiality that actually needs its own, clay needs its own thing, stone needs its own thing, all the media out there. So that's roughly what I have in mind.
As a music educator, and probably as any arts educator, we might face this kind of challenge of navigating between certain structures that we have created ourselves, certain competence and skill level expectations or institutional structures, academization of music and arts, and then there is the child's and all the students' own creativity. And today, in our Arts Equal Sprint, we have been talking about something that has that seems to be one of the main so-called mechanisms that might produce inequality in arts and arts education, and that is the very narrow conceptualization of the so-called normal artistic agency. So that's why I was thinking about this during the talk. Yeah.
Probably what I'm trying to do in relation to that is that you can look at that whole domain in terms of identity, and then you have one discussion, but you can also look at that in terms of subjectness, and then you enter that discussion differently. So the whole question of sort of music proficiency is in a sense an identity question, where you say, okay, we framed music in this way, and now the job is that you gain an identity within that frame. But that never raises the question of the frame itself. Just as Rosa Parks, who said, this is no longer the frame I want to be part of. And I think that is the other question you can ask, and then maybe the whole discussion about equality and inequality shows at least another dimension. That's probably what I try to do here.
Yes. Thank you very much. So many of the things that you said resonate in so many ways that I almost find it difficult to formulate a question. I feel like as someone who's working in arts and education, you really put into words something that I intuitively knew. So thank you. I loved your concept of world-centered education. And I felt like, yes, I want to be a world-centered educator. That I can really it's something to really think about. And at the same time, another voice in my head asked that, well, how to do that in the context where everything is measured and everything is about learning outcomes. Not only for students, so I'm not just talking about how students are measured, but also how teachers, us who are teaching in institutions such as universities, are measured.
Yeah.
Any ideas?
Yeah. Just say no. This is Barbara Bush. Just say no was her response to the whole question of addiction. Fuck the system is what the punks used to say. It comes back to the whole question, who owns the system? And where are we in relation to the system? So although the examples are quite extreme, if you have Rosa Parks and Adolf Eichmann, you see exactly what's happening there. So Rosa Parks said, I no longer want to be defined by that system. So here and now I'm going to refuse that system. So it's a very small act, and at the same time it's the biggest thing you can do. And Eichmann, who said, the system is the system, I'm just an obedient servant of the system, and I have no responsibility and no voice in it. So I understand the dilemma, and at the same time I think, Foucault also says that very nicely. He says, how do we find out if there are any limits? Well, by beginning to push and see how far we can go. I'm also finding that in my own teaching. I do things where colleagues say that's impossible to do in the British University. Well, I escaped in the summer from British universities, but I'm finding things can happen. And I always say to everyone, I do things differently. I'm happy to justify why I'm doing it, but I'm finding that the bureaucrats don't have time even to do that. So there is something about these small acts of resistance where we say, yeah, if we don't want to feed that system, it starts here and now. So I can't offer anything more other than examples where people did exactly that. So this is where the world destruction, it's not where we shouldn't go, the question is how far should we go there. So if we think of this middle ground as just very politely doing nothing, that's not the point. Sometimes we do need to push. But we always have to be careful not to push to the limit. Sometimes we do need to create space for others to step in. But if we do that too much, then there is no I there. So that would be my advice. But yeah, I think the argument, this is what the system wants from us, never works. Or you can just say, well, who's the system? If that, no, well.
Guy, if it's really short, we can. Okay, really short question.
Question is short.
I can't say no to the vice PI. So.
The question is short. I'm sure of the answer. Now, you talk about two extremes existing in the world, trying to overcome what offers resistance, and that leads to world destruction. Shying away from what offers resistance, that leads to self-destruction. Now, what if the ways of acting have already started the world destruction and the self-destruction? What is the way to, I mean, you can't turn the clock back. What's to be done?
And what are you thinking of?
Well, in terms of, say, trying to push boundaries and yet trying to push boundaries, realizing that already starts things to collapse. Then shying away, trying to sort of turn things back to normal, so to speak. But you can't turn the clock back anymore because the sort of process of destruction has already started. And while trying to turn things back normal, you sort of start destructing also destroying yourself, not sort of going where you really would like to go. So you're in a very in a catch-22 situation.
Yes, yeah.
Sort of.
I think that's a fair point and a really good addition, because the way I put it, in a sense, suggests that we can start history from scratch each time, which is not the case. So I think it's valuable to bear that in mind. I still think also what you sketch is the existential predicament, that we are there in this messy middle ground, and that we shouldn't think, well, if we just change all structures, then we have it solved, or if we just make room for everyone, then we have it solved, because those are precisely the points where the solution doesn't lie. So, yeah, I think that is another aspect of this. So there are people who say, let's start by changing the structures, and once we've done that, then we have this free space. But when you begin to work on the structures there, other structures will pop up there. So you can also say these extremes point at ideals that are never real. So if you focus too much of the work there, you'll never get there. But the middle ground is messy also in its historical sense.
So it's a matter of being in the middle ground and continuing with the dialogue no matter what.
Yeah, it's staying with the difficulty, you could say, but also see that there is room for movement. There is this very nice phrase I picked up in England where they say, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And I really like that because I come out of a Dutch culture where you always ask permission before you do something. But when you do that, in a sense, you say, well, we first need to have a perfect system and then we can act. But I've seen that nothing happens and it keeps the power structures very much into place. Because to whom do you go to ask permission?
Thank you again for a very inspiring, philosophically challenging lecture. We will also keep in mind the advice that you gave. And thank you for participating today. I really recommend reading Gert Biesta's work unless you haven't done so. Have a safe trip home.
Good. Thanks very much.